joining us. And if you're trickling in, welcome as you come. I'm just going to open our space with the land acknowledgement before we get to, and then I'll share the space back to Jesse, and he'll introduce the lovely cohort of fellows that we have with us today. So I'll just get started. 221A is based on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The organization is made up of individuals that are respectful but uninvited guests. Some of us were born here. Some of us come from lands of tall prairie grasses. Some of us come from opposing shorelines, and some of us from far off distances. As individuals, we can recognize our own responsibilities to be honest in the ways we enact care upon the land, and to remind each other to tread lightly as we direct ourselves and each other forward, as we forge new paths and look back to ensure those carrying along with us have the means to navigate at their own paces. Constantly, we look with deep inspiration to the rhizomatic work of łaskahikan, new growth, to slow ourselves to a pacing resemblant of trust building as we continue to realize the possible potentials tethered to interconnectedness. This is a place where salty waves meet the shore, where the trees are so thick you need many arms to embrace them, where the rivers and streams bring sustenance to the deep root systems, where the boulders and pebbles remind us of the mountains they broke away from, where the clouds hang low and make the softest light, where the snow only kisses the highest peaks, where the buds turn to blossoms so early, where the leaves form canopies. We commit ourselves as individuals within an organization to conceive of labor existing in ways external to linear time, to remind ourselves of the ones who came before us, and to be diligent in the ways we tenderly hold space for those to come, for those to rise up, for those fatigued, and for those determined by the rigor of resistance and the softness of resilience. I didn't say my name. My name is Nicole Kelly-Westman. I'm the Education and Learning Programmer at 221A. So I'm really excited that we have this opportunity to gather together and introduce the fellows. And I'll just hand it over to Jesse, who's maybe over this way over there.
Great. Thank you, Nicole, for that generous, poetic welcoming and introduction and setting the tone for our event today and keeping the land front and center. My name is Jesse McKee, and I'm the head of strategy at 221A, and my role is responsible for leading the organization's programming, research, communications, and advancement. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this introduction to our fellowship program this year. So thanks for sharing your time with us to learn more about the research and ideas that our fellows are developing. For those who are joining us and are new to 221A, we're a nonprofit organization that works with artists and designers to research and develop social, cultural, and ecological infrastructure. As a charitable society, we envision a pluralistic society where all people have the means to make and access culture. I'd like to take a moment to share with you a sketch of 221A's programming model and fellowship program. 221A operates not so much as a presenting organization, but rather through a research and infrastructure model. So unlike an exhibition model for a visual art and design organization, 221A's operating model supports cultural workers over extended periods to lead the organization's pursuits, engaging deeply with context, collaborators, ideas, audiences, with a focus on the development of research that leads to new social, cultural, and ecological infrastructure. Since 2018, when we pivoted to this operating model, 221A has worked with 11 fellows to conduct research over periods of 3 to 24 months each, and they receive a living wage stipend to lead new research on potential social, cultural, and ecological infrastructure, while staff like me, Nicole Kelly-Westman, and Tao Fei, who's our technical operator today for this webinar, and she works as our program producer. We work alongside the fellows to resource and translate research into public education, learning programs, and plans to develop new infrastructure into the future. So today we'll hear from our fellows who will present their research projects, which we're still feeling like we've just left the starting point of. So consider today a look ahead to what's grounding our programming this year. Thankfully, land, territory, and ecology seem to be a common thread amongst the projects. And we'll also hear about the ways that digital technology and territory are converging in perhaps more socialized and ecological ways, unlike the ways we experienced in the 20th century when industry met territory. So this advancement of digital technology over land, property, energy production can open up new forms of rights and access agreements that have different forms of governance that are seated kind of in people power. So the stacking and layering of the land is nothing new for the digital space. So since the tech industry's origins, land has always been intrinsic to the identity and functioning. So just think of Silicon Valley in California, the Silicon Prairies in Texas, and now we have Crypto Valley in Switzerland. At the same time, land and territory have become one of the central focuses of cultural praxis, being tied to both ecological movements and anti-colonial momentum. This invites the cultural worker to bring their theoretical learning, cultural research, and discursive practices to contribute to multidisciplinary renegotiations between the ever complexifying forms of relationships between humans and non-humans in the world. And we need major structural reorganizing in these relationships amid accelerating emergencies and contingencies in this 21st century, namely automation and global heating. A few notes of order. You'll notice as an audience member, you'll have your cameras off for this event, so please relax and do as you would at this time of day where you are. I hope you may be enjoying a snack, having a tea, or maybe folding laundry. That's what I found myself often doing throughout the pandemic when I'm listening to presentations and conferences. Each of our fellows will present their research for about 10 to 15 minutes each. We'll have some discussion time afterwards amongst the presenters. I'm super keen for this portion as it's the first time our fellows will have had the time to meet and discuss their work with each other. Then we'll open to questions from the audience. So please pose your questions in the Q&A window, and then you can use the chat window, which is a separate thing, to communicate amongst yourselves, share links, ideas, and the like. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our first presenter, Christina Battle, who's an artist who resides in Edmonton, and in Cree, this territory is known as Amiskwaciy Wâskahikan. And she holds a Bachelor of Science with specialization in environmental biology from the University of Alberta, a certificate in film studies from Ryerson University, an MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute, and a PhD in art and visual culture from the University of Western Ontario. I don't usually read through academic accolades, but for Christina, because she has such a broad scope of knowledge and training, I thought it was important to include that there. Her research and artistic work consider the parameters of disaster, looking to it as action, as more than mere event, and instead as a framework operating within larger systems of power. Through this research, she imagines how disaster could be utilized as a tactic for social change and as a tool for reimagining how dominant systems might radically shift. I'll also mention Christina has a current exhibition ongoing at the Mackenzie Gallery, so check out their website for further details on her Connecting Through Grasses project. Christina, I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to talk while I share my screen, but thanks to 221A and to Tao and Nicole and Jesse for creating this space and this amazing opportunity also today just to speak more with one another and get to know more about one another's works and where we're coming from. It has been such an amazing pleasure to work with all of you so far, so I'm really looking forward to continuing that through this new, like, super wild, weird year that we're having. All right, so I'm gonna introduce a little bit about where I'm coming from, a little bit about where I'm thinking of going with this research project. As Jesse mentioned, at least for me, and I'm sure for others as well, this research is still just in the mode of taking shape. So I'm gonna give you sort of like a broad view of what it looks like. So I'm hoping you can see a screen that's trying to point toward reminding you to take care during these times. So as Jesse introduced, I'm in Amiskwaciy Wâskahikan in Treaty 6 territory, which is also known as Edmonton, Alberta, the ancestral and traditional territory of the Plains, the Wood Cree, the Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, and Métis. Amiskwaciy Wâskahikan sits in the Aspen Parkland, which is the transition zone between prairie, where prairie and forest meet. My research for 221A looks closer to systems of exchange. Seeking to move beyond capitalism's built-in cycles of breakdown, I'm looking to strategies of trade utilized by plants and seen across online systems to imagine alternative systems of exchange. And my research and practice thinks deeply about the concept of disaster. and has for quite some time now. And I've been trying to think lately about how to express what it feels like to have been sitting with this idea and this concept of disaster for so long, and to be engaged with it so deeply while also going through some pretty big collective crises right now. And I thought this fire meme made sense as a visual representation of this feeling. It's become a part of internet language now, so I'm sort of assuming that you've come across it or seen it. But just so that we're all sort of reading it in the same way, it usually is used to help indicate a sort of deliberate ignorance to the shit show unfolding all around you in a way that also recognizes that one does in fact know and is actually quite aware of the shit show, but is either deliberately ignoring it or perhaps helpless, unable to really do much about it. But I was thinking about this line of text, this is fine, and thinking perhaps this is a better appropriate description of the feeling I'd like to be better able to express right now. I think the font is probably a little tiny on your end, so I'm going to read through it. When you've been studying and thinking about crisis for so long and then plunged into crisis on a number of fronts, and it's exactly how you figured it'd be, but you also see a lot of good and care bubbling up and want to focus on that and prioritize it and support it. But both your parents have been really sick and your work is all precarious, so you take on a lot in fear of not knowing when you'll get paid next. And there's a pandemic going on and your government is taking advantage of the moment by ushering in super austere and disempowering policy, like cutting healthcare and greenlighting open pit coal mines and giving bailouts to extractive, exploitative, dying industries. And oh yeah, they took your parents' pension. And white supremacists are trying to overtake the US government, and their supporters are on the rise in this country too. And you wish you could just sit and reflect on all this and what it means, but you're constantly in response mode, which basically feels like sitting in a room that is burning up in flames all around you. But it's fine, because at the end of it, you know that a lot of good will come from the shifts that are bound to happen, because the system we've all been living through all this time is complete bullshit, and there is no way for it in the future but collapse. So I also want to say that I wrote that a few days ago, and I feel like things have already shifted, like in ways that maybe we can continue talking about a little later on today. So I've come back to this tweet from Naomi Klein a number of times. It's from back at the start of the pandemic, first being on the radar, at least in this country. And she points to one of the main concerns at the center of my research, which is to look at the complexity of disaster as a framework, especially its relation to overarching systems like capitalism, white supremacy, and neoliberalism, and recognizing that these things very much overlap with one another. In this tweet, she speaks to some of this overlap and the intersections of the environmental, economic, social, and political. And if you've been following, this whole saga regarding the Keystone Pipeline has gotten even more ridiculous in the last couple of days. So I'm sure a conversation around that 2 days from now will be entirely different again. So this is an example of one of the ways I've approached this complexity recently, an essay that I wrote where I was thinking through both collective memory and forgetting, and about what it means to be caught in the neoliberal loop. The labor issues that I was revisiting in the essay from 1986 connect quite directly to those that we're seeing now, made more visible across the pandemic in numerous sectors of the workforce. And these are in regard to a meatpacking plant here in Alberta that has made headlines since the spring. In my spending time thinking about the complexity at work across disaster, I'm interested in looking to other models and systems for comparison and overlap, and for strategies of considering it otherwise. One of the places where I look for systems of overlap is to technology, to satellite technology and tools for mapping, to the internet, especially social media, and the ways that we engage with these complex systems, as well as how we come to know, experience, and reflect on disaster through them. I think about social media a lot, and about our relationship to these public spaces that are wholly owned and operated by billionaires, making continual profit off of our most intimate moments and struggles. My work is especially interested in situating conversation at its center, and in thinking about its role within community and publics, and how it operates, and especially how it adapts based on online technology. And I just thought I'd throw this recent tweet up there from Jack Dorsey, because it's been on my mind a lot this last few days since it was tweeted. And I find it quite fascinating, especially the disconnect within it this idea of a corporation dominating the public square and their role in shaping and setting the guidelines for public discourse and conversation. I think we live in really interesting times right now that I feel really lucky to be spending time thinking about more deeply. One of the other places I look to for systems and strategies to learn from is to plant systems. And I've learned a lot from this ongoing seed saving project that I have called Seeds Are Meant to Disperse. The seeds are offered as barter or gift, and the project hopes to draw attention to issues related to food security and sustainability, species diversification, seed copyright, climate change, urban renewal, and anti-capitalist forms of exchange. I look to both plant systems and systems of technology to think more about notions of spread. And one goal of the Seed Saving Project is to engage with the notion of spread by disseminating ideas outward from the garden as a form of community building. And one of the ways that I approach the complexity of disaster is a focus on looking at community and the ways that individuals come together in times of crisis, as well as the movement between online and offline spaces. For imagining new systems of exchange, so this research that I'm thinking about and working through with 221A, I'm taking time to think more deeply about and develop a publication surrounding this overall research. And I come to define publication by pulling from Matthew Stadler via Publication Studio's approach to publication as a political strategy that constructs a public and extends beyond the written page. And so this new work will take on a number of forms: a series of conversations where I learn from and collaborate with others, a living research document that extends research and ideas on to others, and a participatory project that engages with publics and shifts responsibility of performance onto participants themselves, which will later then be folded back into the overall research. And this slide is taken from the first conversation that is in the process of being developed for this research, which I'm calling the forecast. I've been thinking a lot about what is necessary in order to shape collaborative and engaged conversation that has the potential to collectively result in the development of new models and systems situated around forms of exchange. So I've just repeated this sort of primary question that we'll be engaging with as a small group, collaborating together and thinking through some of these connections across plant systems, online spaces, and economic models, and how we might move beyond capitalism's built-in cycles of breakdown. And then finally, this research will be utilized to develop a framework for a larger participatory project that thinks more specifically about 221A's semi-public space. And again, thinking about this balance between working collectively online and how that might engage with offline spaces. Thanks, that's it. I'm really looking forward to our conversation and any questions that folks have as well.
Great, thank you so much, Christina. I'm just going to go back up to my notes to introduce you to DOMA, our next presenter. DOMA is a nonprofit organization that proposes a smart contract-based community housing system in order to produce more equitable conditions for urban living. DOMA is a platform for network scale leveraged home ownership and distributed governance. So presenting their project today will be Maxim Rachmanenko, who's calling in from Kiev, Ukraine. And Maxim is an architect, designer, and entrepreneur. His research and design work explores new forms of urban living enabled by emerging technologies. He's the founder of the architectural practice And Architects, one word, in Kiev, and he's a partner at the Center for Spatial Technologies, also in Kiev. So, Maxim, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Jesse. By now you should be able to see my screen. And obviously, first of all, I would like to say big thank you to 1A. And Tao, Jesse, Nicole, it's been really fantastic, and it's only the start. So I'm going to talk a bit about this project, which is called DOMA. And it is a very collective project in nature, a collaborative project that I should acknowledge many other people who worked on it. Francesco Sebregondi is not here with me today, but he's an active part of the project, also the team of the Center for Spatial Technologies, my colleagues at Strelka Institute with whom we started the project. I mean, the basic premise of the project is kind of revolving around this kind of concept of housing crisis, which may manifest differently in different places in the world, but the patterns are kind of similar everywhere you go. All around the world, an increasing percentage of people are priced out of real estate markets with no prospect of ever owning a home. And capital income, especially if you count housing, is displacing labor income. With this kind of rise of housing prices, housing became the world's biggest asset class, which kind of puts this issue of affordability into the epicenter of many different disciplines. And myself as an architect, I've been really focusing on issues of sustainable, affordable housing for a while. And I took part in many architecture competitions that kind of look into that issue. But at some point, it started to feel like architecture is not the medium of how you can address this issue in the most kind of scalable way. So with DOMA, we kind of think about this way, instead of designing the kind of physical objects in the city, to try to think about how to figure out how can we change things around circuits of value that are attached to homes. And we envision DOMA as an urban software that kind of connects people and residential spaces in a different way, in a way that is based on kind of collaboration and collective ownership. So the way it works is there are two basic principles that we kind of have in the core of DOMA. First one is tokenization, and the idea of tokenization is that each property is split into micro parts, which are shared between the people who bought them. And by doing this, we kind of are trying to give access to property market in a way that, like, you know, big financial institutions have access to it to store value with a much reduced threshold of entry. So everyone can invest small amounts into housing, basically. And the second idea is that people who dwell in the apartments, because there is this kind of fractionalized asset, which is a DOMA token, they would kind of also be able to generate shares of equity in the DOMA platform the more they live in an apartment. So it always felt to me like there is something very unfair about paying rent for 20 years and, you know, having zero ownership in a place you rent. And with DOMA, the idea is that naturally, by bringing value into the platform, you also are kind of benefited for that. And we are kind of prototyping different models to do that. Obviously, God is in detail, so there's a lot of conversation about these kinds of paybacks and how quickly one can generate equity and what is fair and what is valuable. But the basic idea is to just augment a good old cooperative model with technology, contemporary things like blockchain and like platforms. So we think about ways to enable multitude of people to get together and coordinate, even if they don't know each other, which is a big problem for current cooperatives to scale, right? It's often based on local communities that are kind of, there's a limit to the scale they can reach. And in that sense, the kind of idea of the project is also to turn housing somehow into commons. So with DOMA, the community of stakeholders collectively owns the portfolio of properties. And it's a step away from the traditional one family, one house relationship to home, which is basically, again, for us, it's a step towards kind of establishing housing as commons. So DOMA facilitates the emergence of these kinds of new models of urban living, sharing, organizing, and caring that fits the diversity of today's city. And what you heard by now is kind of a presentation that we went through. We went to different places, mostly in Europe, and presented it in many different cities. And I'm going to talk a bit about where it's going towards with 221A. One thing that is important to say is that DOMA was first thought for the context of Ukrainian cities. In Ukraine, mortgages are extremely expensive as a percentage of income. They're absolutely, like, these are all Ukrainian cities. It's absolutely unprecedented kind of price. Therefore, almost only 2% of property transactions are happening with the help of financial instruments such as mortgage. Most of people need to borrow from friends. They, collect money in cash, and it's all quite messy. Another parameter that we're looking is this kind of price to rent ratio, right? How many years you need to rent such that you would pay for rent as much money as you would to buy that flat, right? So these parameters are key to what we do, right? Because when we are invited to Copenhagen, we understand that the kind of the solutions there, the kind of diagnosis of a housing crisis there, should differ from this context. And in 2019, we were invited for this to participate in this major show, which was meant to be at Philadelphia Museum of Art, Walker Art Center, and Art Institute in Chicago in the US. And we were kind of invited to present DOMA and to think about these kinds of almost like global implications of something like DOMA. And for that project, we started to collaborate with Francis Tsang, who is a New York-based programmer. And what we started to do is we started to model certain cities. For this kind of game, which you can access at play.doma.city, we kind of started to embed certain parameters that are kind of key to understand certain cities. For instance, this is a little model of Philadelphia, where the first show was meant to take place. You know, the exhibitions were canceled because of the virus, but the kind of nature of how Francis works is also has to do with this kind of agent behavior modeling. So he kind of tried to encode certain behaviors that each of these agents kind of have. And the core idea here is to try to get into the core of why there's this divide between home ownership and there's always seems to be a conflict that kind of is quite hard to tackle. And with the Philadelphia, we started to build this model. And at the same time, we also did this project with the office which I run, which is called the Center for Special Technologies. And it was done in collaboration with Dark Matter Labs, where we looked at this beautiful park on Manhattan, which is called Highline. And we looked at the gentrification side of things, right? We all know that it's, I mean, I don't know, especially in architecture and landscape architecture kind of world, it's like a landmark, celebrated project. But we also looked at how it affected property prices on Manhattan and how it kind of became this engine of values around this park kind of skyrocketing to the point where like people had their properties rising to 300%. And we also thought about why that happens and how that works, right? When public investment is kind of poured into a certain urban context, and that leads to the fact that kind of we all together pay taxes, build some sort of public infrastructure, but then private individuals benefit from it. And those are not the individuals who are the least kind of already happy and have access to things. So this is where we come to Vancouver. And, you know, in Ukraine, we know Vancouver as this kind of Vogue's top livability city in the world. We were very lucky to visit Jesse and the team in Vancouver, and we kind of had a bit of chance to see how things work in terms of also housing issue. So Vancouver is very interesting for us in many regards, and the project that we are trying to kind of set up right here, you already can see the first results where we try to put all the data from in this case, public office, which collects taxes from properties. They evaluate property prices, and you can see the dynamic of property prices changing from 2006 till now. And the idea is to to try to build this dashboard of housing crisis, right? All of these things that we worked with in different places, we would like to bring them into something systematic and also share it with all of the interesting people who are also asking for these things. So what we're trying to figure out is how can we put together this key parameters that best describe housing crisis almost in a way that would hint at possible solutions. In the same way is when I'm saying that if in Kiev there is no access to mortgage and properties are around, properties are very cheap compared to rent, that state of housing market makes you think about this collective ownership, pulling resources together, collectively buying some properties. That seemed obvious to us when we studied the very detail of housing market here. The same thing we hope to achieve with cities that we know much worse than our home city. And that's why we're building this tool with the help of 221A, and hopefully, in the end of this fellowship, we'll have a chance to share with you what we found out through this process. Very much looking forward to talk about our projects with the diverse group. Very interested to see where the intersections are, and big thanks for having us today. Jesse, I'll hand you the mic. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Maxime. It's great. The map, we looked at the map, I think, on Monday morning, and it's already evolved so much. So your team's been very busy this week. Congratulations. Awesome.
Thanks
and
to
finally,
German, who spent some nights over.
Thank you, German. So finally, our third presenter today is Zasha Kola. And Zasha is a curator who co-founded the research collaborative Black Rice in Tunisang, Nagaland in 2007. And she was the co-founder of the curatorial collaborative Union of Artists and Art Space Clark House Initiative in Bombay. Her art writing and curatorial research turns around contemporary art in Indo-Burma, Myanmar since the late 1980s. And Zasha teaches comparative curatorial theory in the Master of Visual Arts and Curatorial Studies at the New Academy of Fine Art in Milan. She lives and works between India and Italy, and I believe she's calling in from home in Turin this morning. So Zasha, I'll pass the platform over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And what lovely presentations. I'm so happy to be able to share, and I was very lucky to be able to visit all of you at 221A and get a feeling of the space some years ago now. So to Tao, Nicole, and Jesse, thank you. To the audience as well, thanks for joining us and these lovely participants on this panel. Okay, let me share my screen. Will you let me know if I think you see it with the side panel. Is that better now? Okay. So I decided to call this Scorched Earthly and this kind of fellowship, and it comes from the very early work that Jesse mentioned in 2007 and 8, where I was spending a lot of time in a part of India called the Northeast, very weird name, but it consists of many different states, and two of the states I was particularly interested in was Manipur and Nagaland, and they are border areas with China, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and for this reason are really a terrorized part of India, and somehow compared to Kashmir, far less researched and far less present within the Indian imagination, which was a starting point for me. This is just a quote I took from a book on at that time when it was published, it was a 52-year history of a kind of, I wouldn't call it a civil war, but perhaps that's the best word for it. And it goes as long as the one between Israel and Palestine. And the sentence that I came across years ago has always stayed with me as maybe as the starting point for a project like this, which is, it was beyond our imagination that the Indian armed forces would go to the extent of committing the scorched earth policy so barbarously all over Nagaland. Nothing was left unburnt. All the valuable jungle wealth has been destroyed. So if I can read a little bit, prolonged militarized presence shores up to me images of destruction, implies the brutalization of populations, also through the legalized brutalization of their lands. The Northeast also had aerial bombing, to curb sedition. And what I need to mention is that it's also an area very high in forest land, biodiversity, and various ethnicities, various peoples. It tends to be represented as a place of insurgency, successionist violence that threatens the Indian democracy. And the art of Nagaland tends to be framed as handicraft or artifacts of ethnography and visual anthropology. We're not told of how the Indian army burnt 860 villages and granaries in Nagaland, how to smoke out insurgents the army burnt the forests, and how when the villagers returned, they had to cultivate the bitter, poisonous fields. So I think I need to also say that anthropology has a strange connection with colonialism, especially in this part of the world. But, anthropology couldn't have happened without the whole colonial practice. And Abraham Lotha has written a fantastic book on this and started a very different kind of living museum with contemporary artists. And it really goes against this kind of anthropological view. I pulled out this image. Actually, it was sent to me while I was explaining this project to the artist Nalini Malani. I don't know how many of you know her. And she sent me an article about ecocide and its history. And this is a story from the Mahabharata, an epic in India. And so it talks about the burning of a Kandava forest, the killing of all its fauna, the birds, the species of the lakes and the ponds when the water boiled. It goes into great detail about how everything had to die. It was carried out by a hero, and that's what makes this really unusual in Indian mythology also, by Arjun and a god, Krishna. And they were clearing out warrior serpent tribes, the original inhabitants of the forest, and these people were displaced. Indra, the king of the gods, who was himself the protector of this forest, but he was defeated by these two heroes and the entire forest was burnt. And Krishna and Arjun, these two, one hero, one god, they set up a new palace and they call it Indraprashta, after Indra, the god who tried to protect and save the forest. And it's an early record of ecocide, I think, in our contemporary eyes, and probably describes very real events or a whole history of events from 3,000 years ago and before. And it's around this forest was most likely around the current capital of Delhi in the Indo-Gangetic plain, which was very rich in forest land and was slowly cleared for agriculture. You have the same story depicted also in Cambodia, in Angkor, here you see the serpent figures as well, who were burnt, displaced. Just to make it not only an Indian story, I mean, I also thought about Gilgamesh. There's a story, there's a tablet 5 of the Gilgamesh, which says, "My friend, we've cut down the towering cedar whose top scrapes the sky." So this was a cedar forest, a sacred cedar forest. "Make from it a door 72 cubits high, 24 cubits wide, 1 cubit thick. Its fixture, its lower and upper pivots will be out of one piece. Let them carry it to Nippur. The Euphrates will carry it down. Nippur will rejoice." So it's about the murder of the guardian of the sacred cedar forest, where the gods lived, and again, it was to haul off the timber that they cut, that the hero again cuts, to take it to Mesopotamia to build a palace. So these are images of the Amazon forests, and that's not surprising. This is both from 2020. And this is from 2017. This is in Myanmar. And this is an image of burnings. These are also satellite images. But you see, this is 27th August, and this is 11th September. And here the burning is, we're looking at a genocide. We're looking at satellite images of what a genocide looks like, where a village, this image comes from Amnesty International. And this is their caption: "Before and after imagery shows how the Rohingya areas of Indin, the village, were destroyed while nearby areas of other ethnicities were left unscathed." And so I know I'm trying to put many geographies together. I'm thinking about Canada. I'm thinking about the landscape of this area between India and Myanmar. And yet, you know, and this seems to imply some kind of universal idea, and I'm not yet ready to call this earthly. I think it's a bit dystopian, and that's where the scorched earthly becomes useful to me. It's a kind of universalism that we all share or are sharing, that is of you know, these geographies as well. And it's a kind of grounding method, I guess, that I will use for the fellowship. So I also want to see where it can go and how to link disappearance, the forcible and legal removal of people with the way we treat landscape, how these things are no longer separable, how they've become the same thing, which is something I was looking at in 2007, but it's just become far more obvious as we speak today. So again, I'll just read a little bit. "The legal provision for scorched earth logic in militarized areas allows me to connect in an immediate way with geography as terrain without situating the research within geography as contained by national sovereign borders." The capitalist extractivism that began in the period of British imperialism, its long period of social and cultural isolation. We're still looking at Indin after a scorched earth military campaign. And I could go into the, I could go into the history of this, but I don't have time. But I would just like to talk about some of the scorched earth tactics as I've written them. So burning villages, planting landmines, ethnic cleansing that are underway in this area. Ethnic cleansing, forced labor, forced relocation of villages and farms, destruction of houses, arrests without charge, using civilians as slave labor and as mine sweeps, the revocation of citizenship, and pushing into statelessness of indigenous populations, the rape and murder of women, corruption, extortion, extrajudicial killings, mass graves. this is Myanmar, and it's a list of what happened there. And this is an artist who's actually a Canadian artist, but who is grew up in the forests of Myanmar as in exile against the military dictatorship. Savang Wongse Yongwe. He's actually, I think, came to Vancouver at the age of 12 and has lived there ever since. And these are his works on that he recreates certain mass. This one is called Indian, but he also is the one who shared this image with me and has made a kind of abstract work on that. And this is on jade mining, where he looks at the north of Myanmar, a place called Łaskahikan, which has seen, maybe it came in the news a year ago for a flood that lost several lives, but it's maybe I have it was a long kind of scroll. And so something I'm interested in doing with this research is looking at kind of the poems, the woven traditions, and see, how these things interconnect. I also, want to say what's happening on the other side of the border. In India, for example, we have the Foreigner Tribunal order to bring the whole country under Foreigner Tribunal. And this is from the Ministry of Home Affairs. And at first it was unique to the state of Assam, this area in the northeast, where people without citizenship papers in a country where this is commonplace have been placed in prison-based detention camps. But they're now trying to extend this to the whole country. And the Armed Forces Special Powers Act is a really tremendous law enforced in Nagaland and Manipur for decades that in a blanket way legalizes the destruction of forests to root out militants, the burning of granaries, the burning of fields as a form of punishment to villagers suspected of sympathizing with militants. Similarly, in Myanmar, the army has used an array of scorched earth tactics. And I can unfortunately go on, but just to think of the other bordering area, we can't forget what's happening with the Uyghur right now in China. So I know it sounds like a list, but it's just how actually these three countries seem to have and Canada, let's include, have very different political. One is an or almost quasi-military dictatorship. One is supposedly a democracy, and one is, I don't know, a communist capitalist system, and how actually they're all using this idea of a camp this. They all have very interesting uses of the law to carry out scorched earth even today. So yeah, somehow I'm looking at voices that of course confront this, and they happen to do so through weavings, through poems, and this is something I'm looking into in the project. Maybe I say one last thing is that I'm also looking at these figures who are, this is Gaiden Liu, but I'm looking at somebody in Myanmar who's related to Savan called the Mahadevi Yongwe. She led an army, so did Gaiden Liu. And also this lady called the Black Priestess. All these ladies, these kind of spirit presences or priestesses or demigods, and and so it sounds a bit strange to talk about these practices in a kind of political way, but they were using this idea of magic, sorcery, kind of embracing the witch as a political weapon and trying to really win back from the legality of colonialism, this kind of fake legality of the paper and the law, trying to win back. So this was, a freedom fighter from the 1930s, Rani Gaiden Liu, but also trying to win back from the community agrarian reform. And so I'm looking into these figures, these women, but also others who used this aesthetic or this idea of magic to talk back to the law, or to confront the law, or to create changes that they couldn't have done through political change, because as women often they were not really given space for that.
Okay. Thank you, Zasha. That was good. I'm so excited to continue to do this work with you, and find other connection points and find other ways to tell these stories across the borders, and as we're kind of isolated in very much local places these days without the ability to travel that much. So maybe that could be like maybe our first common question to kind of talk about, but especially given this year and how hyper local we've been and how limited we have in terms of our perspective coming through the screen or coming through narratives from other people that we are connected to and sharing stories with us. How do you approach working with the territories in the way that you do and thinking through the life of these territories through this kind of simulation and the real? And that could both be through a technological lens, but also maybe for Zasha, for you, the simulation of history and disciplines like anthropology. And how do you negotiate those boundaries? Zasha, do you want to go first?
I don't know if I have a good answer, because I feel like we're learning every day on how to negotiate that. I remember feeling really at loss in a way on how to start sometimes. And so, however, I think we still create very local networks, and thankfully there's so much support from 221A and so much mentally as well that you really bother to get into my head a bit. And I have to say that has become the strategy, that because without somebody there, it's not the same. I don't think so. Your being there is extremely important. Similarly, with those who are, living and experiencing or spending time in certain areas. Some of the projects of Sawan Wongse are very interesting because he's in touch with people on the ground. So many of his reconstruct, but it's very difficult for him to be there when you're first to be there in certain kinds of situations. And in that sense, these are reconstructions based on first-hand reports. And that's also a very powerful way in which artists enter certain kinds of space. So he's almost like an investigative journalist himself, but he puts all that together in kind of drawing the missing history that we will never see, or giving it an image. So.
Maxime, maybe do you want to talk a little bit about that boundary between the simulation and the real, between your work, and how maybe you or the team kind of talk about this and approach this challenge?
Yeah, no, there's my mind is just all over the place because of there's these presentations they have something in common, and I'm trying to spot what's the best way to phrase that. But sure, I mean, for us, we work with simulations quite a lot, and it's our way to kind of understand something in a different way. There's this kind of I don't remember who said it, but I read the other day this kind of quote that says that the model is not an image but an engine, and it's kind of this idea that it's not like with a model you not just only represent something and then it's like whatever, like let's just let it sit. It's also something that you can actively do. So for us, kind of studying this Vancouver case is is definitely kind of an attempt to go towards there. But I mean, I also had to Google the word scorched because I didn't know it. And we actually I mean, it's a massive project that happens here in Kiev that has to do with like trying to understand events of Second World War, because, you know, Ukraine is only recently independent, so there's still archives that are like classified and stuff. And we are involved into this project where part of it is trying to understand how apparently Soviets exploded most of the city center when Germans entered the city. So like we are literally like working with that material now, like working with the footage, the film footage that we found, and, you know, like trying to figure out all the, and also like doing this kind of forensic study of, you know, the architecture of the city and how it changed and how those things are. So I mean, for me, like Jesse, you probably know that this question of modeling and like kind of real and the model is kind of almost a core thing to what we do. But I mean, yeah, it's also fascinating to think about it in connection to other presentations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that idea of the engine. Modeling something can bring us somewhere else, or it can give us an image of where to go. Or I guess in some ways, maybe this, Christina, you could touch on this too, is like, what's not just modeling, it's like we're mirroring things like between worlds, and then they seem to be meeting each other in certain ways, and that goes in good directions and bad directions in some ways. But maybe, Christina, you want to talk about that really in relation to your practice?
Yeah, thank you. I am loving all of the presentations and conversations. I feel like Maxime said, I have like a million things going on in my mind right now at once. I think for me, like I'm thinking about this relationship. I might stray from what your question began, where it began, but this relationship between like thinking about technology in one space and another space, online and off, in a few different ways. One of the ways that I sort of think about it in this more sort of aerial perspective or like macro view is thinking about how it is that technology and these online spaces are shaping how we visualize the world or how we come to know the land that we're on. I loved something that Zasha said about the satellite image as like an image of genocide, and like thinking about how our relationship to an idea, a concept, a trauma like genocide might be mediated through technology. And something that Maxime said about at the beginning of your talk about patterns, and it really struck me how you were talking about gentrification and sort of these developments in urban centers as being really unique and specific locally in different places. But then there is this pattern that's common across all of it. And for me, that's sort of how I situate thinking about technology and these sort of things that we have in common, that I think has been really magnified across pandemic as we've been moved and sort of not forced into spending more time online, but a little bit. And so for me, that's been really useful in some ways to think about like what it means to be on this land where I am located now, but then also pulling from ideas and concepts and strategies and tactics that others are using in other localities. And then sort of building community that way. So sort of, you know, like trying and working to build community where I am and sort of to think about how it is that we might address some of the like pretty terrible things that are happening in this province where I live right now. But also as a way to get the word out a little bit and to sort of spread the experience of what's happening here. Because one of the things I've really realized since moving back to Alberta is there's a real lack of understanding across even the country, across other provinces of really having a view of what's going on the ground here. And so I'm really thinking about this idea of spreading just experience as well and how technology can help support that. But then also like pulling from tactics that others are using, because as Maxime referred to, like these things are happening all over the world. And there are tactics that I think are useful that can be modeled or mirrored, Jesse, as you alluded to, and sort of pulled from. And I think now nowadays, like that sort of expanding beyond the local is kind of necessary to help us relate to the local a little bit stronger.
Kind of picking up on that thread, Christina, I just I noticed even in the act that you guys, at least two of you, had memes as your opening images. And I know that like spending deep time with a lot of your research, like they're really big, complex, challenging ideas. And I think each of you individually, like with DOMA, like even thinking about Vancouver's like really challenging history of this huge other curve of inaffordability, it's really beautiful to witness then this mapping of it being, you know, like it's not a super dense, heavy research. You get to like have the access of witnessing how that transitions, or like this visual translation. I think about this also like in forecasting with you, Christina, like how bringing the community together instead of just giving them like a research report or something, but generating the conversation as a place to gather, like how that might be a different way of sharing or accessing knowledge. But even Zasha is like almost, I think a lot of the things that we've been talking about is like weaving or poetry. So it almost feels like it's like that that translation is almost like the opposite sort of translation of like the visual object holding all this complexity and then having to translate that complex sort of ancestral knowledge out of that object. But I wonder if you can talk about like the ways that like community is generated through the ways that we share knowledge. And so I don't know if that's if that resonates with you folks.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in just because you've sparked some sort of things that I've been thinking about. Because so far, at least the sort of tangible exchange that's beginning to happen in my research with this project, I've been really thinking a lot about how to shape conversation with others in a way that also considers thinking about exchange and not just extraction, but working collaboratively from the beginning. And I think Jesse and Tao and Nicole, you all know how this in some ways has been not a hang up, but yeah, it took me a while to sort of think it through, really wanting to not only have a conversation that moves outward to others, like how I think often, you know, Zoom presentations do. I think we're moving beyond that here, but engages with a larger conversation as well. So recognizing that I want to sort of collaborate with people as opposed to just like talk to them or talk outward to them. So I'm really thinking about how we can come together, you know, beginning with like visual cues or things that we might have in common or texts that come from elsewhere as a starting point, how we might generate images on our own that sort of reflect on the knowledge that we're reading together or thinking through together, and then how that can be the starting point for a conversation as opposed to sort of the end point of a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I can say a quick thing that was actually a proposal of Jesse last time he saw research, was to kind of, instead of just like a strange Ukrainian team who's crunching data from Vancouver, to also kind of use it almost like prompt to then talk to some of the most prominent researchers who study Vancouver housing crisis. And for me, it's like, I mean, it's both obvious, but also a thing that this was like not necessarily directly in our immediate plans. So, I mean, things like that where, you know, like this tax data exists as this kind of impenetrable Excel sheets that are like, you need to spend some hours to even like, you know, open properly. And then kind of trying to get them into an image that is kind of implying something, and that looking at which you kind of immediately can see certain patterns. I think it's really powerful, kind of similarly to what Christina just said, right? That it kind of can also generate a conversation that it wouldn't happen otherwise. And it kind of can almost become something more than an image, you know, like something that is, again, sort of an engine. I don't know if that's directly kind of responding to what you said, Nicole, but that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, definitely. Like I feel like those visuals, but or even like I feel like the ways you guys have like some of your decks and stuff too, it's like that similar sort of like breakdown. So breakdown of the knowledge so it can be accessible to different kinds of folks. But yeah, I really like what you say about like even just like finding the like the barriers to like, okay, how do you find the Excel sheet? How do you get the Excel sheet open? How do you actually read or understand the knowledge? And then eliminating all those big hurdles allows a different kind of participation. So you totally answered my question or prompt. But Zasha, sorry, yours is like the opposite side of the question. Like, yeah. Well, I think it's really beautiful the way that you're thinking about like weaving. Like I felt like a lot of our conversations around the beginning are like, how does a weaving hold knowledge? But it's like kind of the visual starts before and then the complex knowledge comes after or something.
Yeah, I would really like to find, you know, I don't know. I keep finding these spirit practices. I don't know what to call it. Spirit, not spiritual, but you know. And I have a hunch I might find some more. This is, you know, this is the way I'm trying to look, but I might be totally wrong. But I'm looking through, yes, weaving poetry, but it's not really what I'm really looking for is these ideas of a kind of oral tradition, I guess, that has preserved some of this power. For me, it's something that's very contemporary. I don't think it's gone. I don't think it's incompatible with, you know, and I really liked what you said, Maxime, about the model. I wish I knew more about that, because I think that the model is something that does things. You were quoting someone, but there's something like this, that the model or the fiction is not a simulation, but it's doing something. And you're able to activate something. I think that this is really a powerful idea, and I would, I don't know how I will use it, but I'm sure it's similar to you know, coming up with a missing archive or missing image also of a history, but in one way it's that, and it's definitely doing something, but it's also I think by making a change in the model, we can visualize, right, what we need, what it might be possible. So, so yes, somehow I just wanted to mention that it doesn't relate to my project, but I do like visual things. I like tangible things as well. Even, and I think some of the way your modeling is quite tactile, and or the meme, you know, and this is really important to me, this ability to visualize it, because it's going back to a kind of idea that the imagination is political, and that the more we visualize it, the more we enact a new politics. So
Zasha, I think that's a good point to continue. I think like when you brought up Rani Gindalu and you described talking about sorcery as strange, I didn't think it was strange at all, because what maybe they called sorcery in the 1930s, we call vibes in 2020. And, you know, I think we know the power of vibes in the story and the mimetic momentum that we can fall under. And we've seen very negative examples of that in recent years. And I think we need to look at these moments more concretely and investigatively and figure out, like, what are these mechanisms that push us in these directions? Like almost it's like a fungus that communicates amongst itself, like thinking about Christina's work and the images of these fungi spreading across surfaces. But this seems to be the mimetic energy. And so where does it come from, and how do we use it to go in different directions, like to go in the direction of something like Maxime's and DOMA's project? And how do we get this sorcery or this vibe to kind of push us in this direction?
thank you, that's helpful. Yeah. I should stop saying that, because sorcery is the word. It is a colonial word used to describe the practice. but I like the embracing of it and taking it to its, kind of absurd logical conclusion that yes, she.
I'm sorry.
Go on.
I'm just thinking, I love thinking about this idea of mechanisms and models and where they overlap and where they differ. And it seems to me that model, and I agree, Maxime, the way that you defined it was really lovely as this sort of active term, something, it implies change, it implies the ability to be flexible and to change, and how mechanism implies sort of the opposite of this sort of like rigid structure that isn't pliable. But I think, or I sort of hope at least that for me, like thinking through crisis and disaster is a way to redefine mechanism as strategy and realize, it actually is just a model. And if you think about it as a model, it can be flexible and it can change. It doesn't have to exist forever the way that it is. And like, hopefully this is something that maybe another one of these patterns that we all have in common is realizing that all of these things can shift over time, especially right now, hopefully, or maybe.
And with the housing, it's something so concrete. You think you'll never be able to shift something as ingrained as that, something as globally ingrained as that. It's capitalism at its best, I guess. So, I want to say something that goes in a totally different direction, but I don't want to lose I wrote it down. You said something about where the prairie and the forest meet. You were talking about. What were you describing?
Yeah, so the biome or the ecosystem that I live within is called the Aspen Parkland. And essentially it is that sort of point where on the land where prairie and forest are constantly in constant tension with one another, constantly trying to sort of overtake the other and push one another back, but live very much in balance with one another. And sort of maybe just also recognize that that ecosystem is also very much at sort of the mercy of extraction and industry and exploitation of the land itself. But in its natural sense, the two biomes or the two ecosystems work to generate this biome that's constantly in flux, which I think is quite beautiful and sort of where I help situate this thinking about disaster as well.
And I just feel a very strong connection with that idea of this meeting edge between two different ecologies. It's something I've been trying to think about in terms of my work, which is not so, it's not in this case only ecological, but speaking not just of forests actually, but the meeting edge even between one kind of area and a river, one kind of ecology and the river, because I started to look at very scientific papers about how it's the meeting edge that is the most biodiverse, not the center of the forest, but the edge where it meets, a desert or meets a very different kind of ecology, but also happens to be the place that coincides with hotspots, places that are also the most in danger and also the most hotspots, also because the place is most in conflict, human conflict, most under human conflict. And so I was, it's a statistical thing, it's a mapping, but I wonder whether you relate to these things. If I say them to you, do you feel that compared to the center, it's these meeting edges where you have somehow the best natural resources, the most human contaminations leading to the most, by contaminations, I mean most different kinds of cultural diversities, different ethnicities. At least historically, it would have been the case that people are drawn to the meeting edge. And it seems that it is biodiverse and probably also minerally diverse if it's leading to extractivism. And so, Yeah, no, I really thought it's interesting you marked that in your presentation, this between the prairie and the forest.
Yeah, and I think you're speaking to like both the sort of the beauty of it and the trouble with it, because you're exactly right that I think that that's where extractive industries are sort of most attracted to, because of things like diversity within ecosystem. And so it's this sort of constant also tension of like the thing that allows, at least in this region, for extractive industries to exist and to succeed is the diversity of the land itself, and it are the resources naturally that occur here. But as the extractive industries pull out and pilfer those natural resources, they too sort of lose their ability as an industry to survive into the future, right? And so it's like this constant boom and bust, which is the cycle that I'm particularly interested in looking at through this research, of how that boom and bust might be sort of leveled and thought about differently, so that we're not constantly at this ridiculous sort of mercy of having excess and then having extreme loss and back and forth.
And you mentioned a pipeline. Is it connected to this area?
Yeah, I feel like we could have a 3-hour conversation about the Keystone Pipeline saga as it's going on right now. Yeah, so it's not happening. Maybe we should just leave it there, despite the, I don't know, provincial desire for it to continue. But maybe this is also something that you were just bringing up about, like I loved this idea of thinking about, when you were talking about, I think you said something about the ladies of spirits, but sort of thinking about the witch, or the idea of the witch, in sort of contrast to politics, or as a strategy for working when politics isn't a space for you to sort of engage with these things. And I think like this is also what's really interesting about this precise moment, where there is all of this flux, but then, you know, like a day passes. And in the case of this region, that day was when a new president was elected in the United States, and how suddenly now this entire perspective, and Keystone Pipeline as an example, like is propelled into this whole other conversation and reality. And sort of that like constant moving over boundaries of like something's one thing one day and the next day it's something else, as maybe another reminder of how these models are pliable, right? They can shift. And maybe there's a way that we can take better control of shifting those models, as opposed to like relying on the way that housing has to be. Why could it not be this other model of housing?
We just have about 10 minutes left, so oh, maybe Tao, you can unmute me.
Sorry, I thought Maxime was...
Oh, we have about 10 minutes left. So maybe I'll open it to the audience. And if you have any questions, just please put them in the Q&A chat window, and we can ask the panelists. And then maybe if you have any questions amongst yourselves, it doesn't have to be through the conversations that we were having. If there's anything scratching your mind from each other's presentations, please do ask away.
While we wait for questions, I just wanted to say one tiny thing about, like, I totally see what Zasha, you're saying by that, you know, housing is kind of materialized capitalism. But just like as an anecdote, the year I was born, the city fully, like, there was no private property, right? So like everyone just had their house. And there was no way to like own a house and sell a house. That was just like, I mean, and it was like 30 years ago. So, I mean, it just kind of, you know, I tease Francesco this way because he's French and he's also grew up in this kind of more Western perspective of like, you know, like home is the essence of economy and stuff like that. So when I'm just saying that to kind of say that, you know, there's like a vast kind of variability of what could potentially happen, though I know that it's very unlikely. So yeah, let's hope for radical things.
I love that tension of like knowing it's possible and also knowing that maybe it's unlikely though, because I feel like that being in that position is where, I don't know, there is so much potential, truly, like, because you're also realistic, but have this vision for something else.
We do have one question from the audience coming from Jennifer Jackson, wondering if Christina can talk more about the potentials of pliability between my earlier proposition between simulation and the real.
I'm just reading so that I can make sure I'm understanding the question right.
Can you see it in the chat window there?
Yeah. The potentials of pliability. Yeah, I think, so maybe I can definitely see the potentials, but maybe where I'm sort of questioning how those potentials are realized is I sort of been thinking about it like, you know, connecting between this simulated space, between virtual spaces, which over the last year for me has been really important and also has really increased a lot. Like I feel like I'm a part of a number of communities now that I hadn't been before. And that is precisely because of the pandemic and things shifting online. But where I sort of question is like, yeah, but what comes next from that? So there are all of these spaces. A lot of them are also BIPOC spaces, which I think is also something that has really sort of taken more shape over the last, like since the summer, essentially. And the spaces are so important and I really value them, but I sort of want to know what happens next. And it might be that the next thing is that those spaces and those communities continue to be virtual, and that's fantastic. And then we sort of take what we learn from those online spaces and engage with them and bring them into sort of offline space in our own localities. But at the same time, like I would love to be in community with those individuals like in the offline world, and we don't all live in the same place or in the same country. So yeah, it's sort of a question, and maybe where I'm at right now with thinking about it is maybe I just need to reframe and rethink how I see value in like offline community, and realize that maybe there's just as much value in these simulated virtual online connections as well. So especially with like my seed saving project and the work that I've been doing with there, I've been really thinking a lot about, yeah, Nicole has it back, from a recent project of like how it is that sort of extending this responsibility onto those who are connecting online together, and then how it's up to them to take that responsibility into their own communities or into their own environments and work with it there. That's a great question. Yeah, maybe it remains to be seen.
Great. Christina, we have another question for you coming from Jeff Dirksen. I'm stuck on your project's push to move outside of capitalism's built-in cycles of breakdown. By turning to other models of exchange, the success of these cycles of creating destruction are themselves naturalized into capitalism. So how do you see your project denaturalizing the way capitalism naturalizes its own cycles of destruction and dispossession?
It's such a great question. I think, yeah, in some sense, my answer is like, it's a question of language in a way, because I think, you know, cycles of breakdown are built into all of these other models of exchange, especially if you're thinking about plant systems. But I think that the way that cycles of breakdown occur are sort of envisioned within plant systems by plants themselves to think forward into the future and to think more collectively. So those cycles adapt based on the collective, I'm picking my language carefully, but based on collective will and collective need. And in turn, then that breakdown doesn't have the same effect that I think it does in a capitalistic system. So there's this balance that I'm sort of striving for. So it's not to say that destruction itself won't always be naturalized, because I think, you know, like there is this sort of necessary environmental need for things to come and things to go. It's sort of a part of it. But I think it's this reframing of thinking about how it's envisioned into the future and who's affected more than other. I hope I'm answering that question entirely. But.
I mean, it's interesting even in terms of, like, if you project this back into housing thing, right? Like, we are kind of used to use this phrase housing crisis, which is like, you know, there's like a status quo. Like, we don't anymore have any other language because we already know that we live in the crisis. So just live with it, right? Like this idea of more advanced vocabulary that like better spots what are the real issues and how to deal with them.
Great. Maxine, speaking of real issues, we do have a question for you from Eric Lesage, and he's asking, I'm interested how DOMA intersects with homelessness. How does the modeling take into consideration communities like tent cities or those who are precariously housed, motorhomes, cars, etc.?
Yeah, it's a point of big discussion in the team. We never publicly talked about how we look at these, and it's a complicated matter for us for the reason that, I mean, also specifically in Vancouver, there's such a big percent of homeless people that when we model things, we should somehow indicate that, right? Like there's like, it's certainly like the thing I mentioned about Ukraine is like, you know, because in 1992, we still had public ownership of properties. We have home ownership rate of something like 92%. And that's like kind of makes us a bit like it makes us look at these things in a bit of a different way. But I mean, I have to respond to this question in a way that like DOMA project looks at it. And the truth is we are not looking at that issue, because what we're trying to do is to basically change a bit of the current situation in a way that kind of imagines an alternative form of ownership. And to do that, it still is quite, I mean, like property is, as I said, one of the most expensive things that people buy, and it's hard to think about it in this kind of complete decommodified way. So we're just kind of trying to create this hack which makes it easier for people, makes it more fair and stuff like that. But I mean, the problem of homelessness is beyond the scope of our project, but it's certainly something that we are often confronted with, and we think about also with other projects that I'm involved with.
And in a way, like, I know that the project of DOMA is really like, you know, you're 2 years out from the conceptualization of the idea, which is pretty bold to begin with. And now we're modeling and testing out certain, you know, what would you call it? Just kind of like case studies on different cities as you're modeling for games and for projects like ours at 221A. But, you know, my understanding of the platform cooperative is that there is collective governance of all users.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a way, these larger issues that are encompassed within the issue that DOMA is tackling, but maybe the externality of it is so grand that the idea can't quite get there yet, that the idea of believing and working in a platform cooperative puts the challenge to the users to figure out what's the governance structure that will allow the network to then resolve these issues locally, and then what do we learn from these local solutions that can then be shared between the different cities that kind of operate in DOMA. So I think it's more the potential of where this can come out of the user group, because of course your team is like 10 people in a 1-bedroom apartment in Kiev working day after day. So it's kind of like, we don't expect you to have all the answers, I don't think either.
Yeah, no, I'm indeed very careful to not say that, you know, we're preparing this kind of massive solution.
Right. All right, and that's all for questions so far from the audience. And maybe we can leave it there because we're at about 11:30 here on Pacific time. So please stay tuned to these projects. And the way you can do that is signing up to our newsletter at 221A.ca, finding us on Instagram or on Twitter. You can email the staff, Nicole, myself, and Tao, and ask questions on how to get involved. There'll be different kind of community building and kind of workshop initiatives to generate knowledge throughout these projects. And I'm just so blessed and thankful for the work that we've been able to do together so far. Maxime and Christina and Zasha and the whole team at DOMA. And I also want to do one big shout out to another member who's working on the DOMA project, but he's a sustainability scholar at the University of British Columbia, Charles Pan, who's in his final year of his Masters of Community and Regional Planning, who's been helping to translate these large data sets with DOMA and understand the issues on the ground here. So thank you, Charles. I think you were listening earlier, but maybe class pulled you back into something else. I don't know. But we'll leave it there. And if you want to go back to this recording, it should be on our website in the coming days. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
See you guys.
Ciao.